Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is 7:30 on a Monday night for the last time for this course. So let us get underway. Welcome to the last and final class of Outsmarting Antisemitism. Tonight's class is entitled, Change of Heart. Because Mike was kind enough to bring the Rabbi Chaim for class, I'm going to begin with a toast. And I think such a L'chaim warrants a joke. It's a very good joke, I have to say. So with that, L'chaim, ladies and gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure spending the past few weeks with you. I look forward, hopefully, to many more in the future. I actually hope that when it comes to meditation from Sinai, Rabbi Zippel Sr. will be back, but this has been delightful over the past 3 weeks, including tonight. So L'chaim to you.
Okay. That's the name of the next one.
Oh, that's very nice, Mike. Are any of you familiar with the Goldberg brothers? The famous inventors? There were 4 Goldberg brothers. Their names were Lowell, Norman, Hiram, and Maxwell. 4 Jewish boys. They lived in Detroit, Michigan, and they are credited with inventing. Anybody knows what they invented? They invented the first automobile air conditioning. They came up with the concept how to cool off a car from the car within. It was a hot summer's day in Detroit on July 17th, actually my birthday, 1946, when they pulled up to Henry Ford's office wanting to sell him their technology, automobile air conditioning. And they came in and they convinced the secretary to let them see Mr. Ford. However, they didn't want to see Mr. Ford in his office. No, they wanted to show Mr. Ford the usefulness of the product they had invented. And so instead, they suggested that they speak to Mr. Ford where? Outside in the car. So they take Mr. Ford outside and it's like 130 degrees and they sit him in the car for a minute and there's sweat pouring off of Henry Ford. And they say, now, Mr. Ford, look what we can do. And they turn on the car and they turn on the air conditioner. And it's incredible. The car begins to cool off. And Ford realizes this is what needs to be put in every car that will ever be made until kingdom come. And this is the future right over here. And so on the spot, Henry Ford offers them $3 million for the patent to their product for automobile air conditioning. This was 75 years ago. $3 million is a lot of money now, just as was even more money then. And the Goldberg brothers come back to Mr. Henry Ford and they say, no, we're not going to take $3 million. We're going to take $2 million, but we have a counteroffer. We would like in every car that you make from now and for all time, that you put our name on our invention. Above the air conditioning, when you install it in the car, we want it to say the Goldberg air conditioning. Mr. Ford was just a wee little bit of an anti-Semite. And Mr. Ford was not going to make his cars that said on it the Goldberg air conditioning. And so they haggled and haggled and haggled until they came to a compromise. Every car that Mr. Ford would make from that day on, instead of it saying the Goldberg air conditioning, would feature the 4 brothers' first names, which is why now, whenever you walk into a car, you will see 4 settings on the air conditioning: low, norm, high, and max. So our class is going to be a little bit about somebody like Mr. Henry. We've been talking a lot about anti-Semitism, its various manifestations, how it comes about, why it comes about. Let's talk about this now in the present day. The reality is that in the public arena, we encounter people in powerful positions, be it in commerce, in media, in politics, that can potentially do us harm. People who might not come out openly and say that they have disdain for the Jews, but yet people whose actions or inactions actually cause problems for our people. It could be a government official who's soft in responding to an anti-Semitic incident. It could be a pundit or a journalist who portrays Jews in a negative light, an actor who will boycott something or other because of Israel, or a university president who doesn't act swiftly to ensure that Jewish students on his or her campus feel safe. So to be clear, tonight's class, we are not talking about the Ahmadinejads et al. Of this universe. We're not speaking about people who openly profess their anti-Semitism with some measure of pride. We're talking about the people who don't openly profess their anti-Semitism, and yet whose actions or inactions speak quite profoundly to the feelings that lay within. You know, whenever we have this conversation, it reminds me, last year I had the most interesting conversation actually on the radio. So last year, is anyone familiar with Roald Dahl, the author of the children's books? Roald Dahl wrote James and the Giant Peach. So last year, someone found be it a diary or a correspondence, like they found something written by Roald Dahl from a very long time ago, in which Roald Dahl professes to be an anti-Semite. So he doesn't beat around the bush and he doesn't, skirt around the issue. He says, I am an anti-Semite. I have problems with Jews. So one of the local talk show hosts on KSL asked me to come on and speak about this revelation that Roald Dahl is an anti-Semite. So I went on and said my piece. I'm not saying we have to burn his books. Roald Dahl is an anti-Semite. So this person comes on the radio, comes on KSL and begins to passionately argue with me. No, it can't be that Roald Dahl is an anti-Semite. He's a good man, and you see it from his works. It's impossible to say that Roald Dahl is an anti-Semite. And I said to this very, very passionate young woman that I'm not really sure why we're having this argument, because Roald Dahl, in his own words, professes to being an anti-Semite. We live in this world where we're all very cautious about this term anti-Semite. You accuse someone of being an anti-Semite, and we talked about this quite a bit last week. I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm just anti-Israel. But people are so hesitant of the term anti-Semite that when someone comes out and says, yes, me, I am an anti-Semite, everyone's like, nah, not really though, right? You're not really an anti-Semite, you're a good guy. So we're not speaking about people like Roald Dahl who come out and say, yes, me, I am the anti-Semite. We're talking about people whose actions or inactions might lead us to go a certain way. I want you to start for a second, those of you who have a writing device with you, take a look at exercise 4.1. So as not to get carried away in controversy, I'm going to ask you not to share this information publicly, but take a moment and think about some people who, in your opinion, might fit this criteria, whether they may be in journalism, entertainment, politics, or academia. Take a stab at it and identify someone who you feel like perhaps is someone we are addressing this evening, someone who may not come out passionately and say, yes, I'm an anti-Semite, but things they do or they don't do might somewhat, Jacob, their pen for their clocks, might somehow betray their coloring on this issue. Take a moment and then we're going to do a fascinating case study. 4.1 is on page 114 in your book.
Not enough space.
Well, just one example per each would be fine. If you would like, feel free to keep a hand throughout the class on page 114. You can revisit your answers later on. I'm going to hold you to them at a certain point in the class and ask you to engage in a thought exercise with me, with the people you've identified. But if you haven't filled them all out yet, feel free to come back to that at some point. We're going to do a little bit of a case study now. Throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, the main supplier of weapons to Israel, then a fledgling nation, was France. France was supplying weapons to Israel on the regular. They were still are a pretty big exporter of weapons, and they were providing weapons to the fledgling Israeli nation. Before the outbreak of the Six-Day War in the late 60s, when tensions were simmering in the Middle East, Israel had ordered, and here's the key point, ordered and paid for 50 Mirage fighter jets from France. In 1967, just before the outbreak of hostilities, President de Gaulle of France placed an embargo against the sale of military equipment to all sides that were participating in the conflict. President de Gaulle said he did not want to supply arms to anybody who was participating in the blowing up of the Middle East. And so, even though Israel had paid for these fighter jets, he was not going to deliver the jets that they had already ordered and paid for. Now, this was a move which only really hurt Israel. Why? Because all the other nations in the region, specifically Egypt and Syria, were not getting their weapons from France. They were getting their weapons from Russia. And so by France deciding to stop selling weapons to everybody in the region, effectively what France was doing was freezing Israel out of weapons at a time when it needed weapons and allowing everybody else to continue to flourish. And obviously pundits at the time, people whose job it is to engage in thought process, thought that this was a move that President de Gaulle was doing to court the Arab nations who were far better customers than Israel was going to be. If you wanted to pick a side in the hostilities, it was better to be on the side of the Arab nations than it was to be on the side of Israel. But if you think this is bad, if you think that freezing Israel out of the arms race just before the outbreak of the Six-Day War, and thankfully we all know how the Six-Day War went, if you think that's bad, things actually get worse with President de Gaulle's successor. In 1970, just before the War of Attrition, which thankfully is a war we don't know a lot about as it never really materialized, things looked pretty grim for Israel. President Georges Pompidou, who was the successor to President de Gaulle, Rick's looking at me like he knows who I'm talking about. I'm from a different generation. Rick, pardon me, the only French guys that I know are Macron and everybody else. President Pompidou said that France would sell the Mirage jets to Libya, but he was upholding the embargo against Israel. So last week we talked about the 3Ds. We talked about the double standard. If you violate the double standard, you might be an anti-Semite. So President Pompidou is not going to sell jets to Israel. Take that back. President Pompidou is not going to deliver the already paid for jets to Israel, but he's willing to negotiate and initiate new sales with Libya. Okay, this is a historical fact. Let's read text one together from the New York Times. Page 116. After much hesitation, French officials acknowledged tonight that about 50 Mirage jet fighter planes would be sold to Libya. The confirmation of the sale was expected to provoke sharp protests from Israel. The Israelis suspect that the planes will sooner or later find their way to the fighting fronts. The French Defense Ministry reaffirmed the French embargo policy on selling no arms to the countries directly involved in conflict. Israel, the United Arab Republic, which at that time was Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and said that they were convinced that Libya sought to supply her own forces. Libya wasn't doing this for nefarious intentions. Libya was just doing it because, oh, I don't know, they liked collecting spare Mirage fighter jets in their spare time. Israeli fears of the Libyan Mirages is based on the conviction shared by some French experts. The Libyan Air Force in its present state could not absorb such numbers of a highly advanced plane. Fear is compounded by the aggressive stance taken toward Israel by the new revolutionary military regime, which has been in power in Libya since early September. The plane sold to Libya is believed to be the Mirage 3, the same type as the 50 built for Israel but placed under embargo in '67. The Israelis are expected to find particularly galling the fact that they have been denied about the same number of planes now made available to a hostile Arab country. I have to say, I do love the objectivity of the New York Times. The Israelis are expected to find particularly galling, meaning this is not something which the average thinking person would find particularly galling. Only the Israelis are expected to find it particularly galling. Must be part of their, unique Israeli makeup. So tonight's thought process is going to be as follows. It's 1970, and President Pompidou has just delivered 50 Mirage jets to Libya. And he is coming to Salt Lake City on an official state visit. And our community had the opportunity to greet President Pompidou, or not greet President Pompidou, or do something with President Pompidou. How should we respond, or how should we not respond? Here's a guy who probably pretty fairly and accurately deserves the term anti-Semite. And now he's here in our backyard. What do we do, if anything? Any suggestions?
He's coming here.
Yes, he'll be driving down 1100 East tomorrow on a state visit. Libya is visiting Utah because they want some fresh honey from the Beehive State. He's coming to watch the Jazz play tomorrow. He's a particularly fan of basketball, President Pompidou is. He'll be here tomorrow. What do we do?
Invite him over and have a conversation.
Invite him over and have a conversation. Okay. Anybody else? Protest. Okay. Good answer. This is a hypothetical. Anybody else for how we should greet the good president from France? I was going to say we could no longer call them French fries, maybe call them freedom fries. That idea is, was already trendy about 20 years ago or something. Yeah, not Rick. Anybody else? Okay, well, the reality is that the Jewish people have been dealing with this quandary and this conundrum for a very, very long time. And so it gives us the opportunity to actually look at Torah sources to determine how we should handle this sort of conflict. And not just in any Torah source, but interestingly enough, that we're teaching lesson 4 this week, there is actually an episode in this week's Torah portion, the portion that we're going to read this Saturday in synagogue, which should give us direct insight into how we should handle anti-Semitism. What should we do about it? In this week's Torah portion, we continue along the narrative that we started talking about over the past several weeks about the famous twin brothers, Jacob and Esau, Yaakov and Esau, who were technically twins. They were born from the same mother. They were born at the same time, but you could not find two people who were more different. Jacob was a man of tents, a person who dedicated his life to study and moral living, and Esau was a good-for-nothing. He was a hunter who put pleasure and expediency above all. Make a very, very long story short, Yaakov did something which Esau did not find particularly appealing, and Yaakov was forced to run for his life as Esau sought to kill him. So Yaakov spent about 22 years away from home. During this time, he marries, fathers a number of children, and after 22 years, he decides it's time to return to the land of Israel to be once again with his parents. And so he starts journeying back to the land of Israel together with his family. And as he's journeying towards the land of Israel, this week's Torah portion begins with the words, Vayishlach Yaakov Malachim Lefanav. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to determine, just to kind of get a lay of the land and get a sense of how Esau was feeling towards him in the present moment in time. And the messengers come back and they say, well, your brother has been made aware of your impending arrival and he has decided to come and greet you himself. And he's marching forward towards you with 400 bands of military, 400 forces of soldiers who are armed to the teeth. And that is the welcome and that is the greeting that he has prepared for you. This should give you a pretty good inclination into how your brother feels towards you at the present time. Well, Jacob, as you might expect, is a fearing man of God, somebody who wants to do the right thing. So Jacob knows that beyond just praying to God, he also needs to create a vessel in this world for God's blessing to take hold. And so the Torah tells us Jacob did 3 things. He prayed, which one might expect him to do. He prepared a gift, and he prepared himself for armed struggle. Mike, read for us text 2 on page 119. Let's see this idea inside.
119?
Yes, text 2.
A midrashic work bearing the name of Rabbi Tanhuma, a 4th century Talmudic sage, quoted often in this work. Midrash is the designation of a particular genre of, is that what you want?
No, where it says Jacob prepared himself, in the middle of the page. 3 steps, under the heading 3 steps.
Jacob prepared himself for a 3-pronged response: a prayer, a gift, and armed struggle.
So Jacob prepares himself to do 3 things. Now, these 3 things are not mutually exclusive. He did 1 for sure, and he did 2 for sure. He sent a gift. The gift, effectively, what he sent was a petting zoo. Okay, so back then, in biblical times, the currency between people who lived in that part of the world were animals. And so he sent an entire shipment of animals, literally a petting zoo. He sent them goats and sheep and rams, camels and oxen and donkeys. And the Torah tells us that he sent them in waves. He didn't send us 1 shipment of animals, but he sent them bunch after bunch after bunch so that this present would come across as being overly impressive. And with every messenger that led one of these herds of animals towards Esau, he instructed the messenger to say, this is a gift from your servant Jacob, to try and curry favor with his brother. Now, whilst he's praying and sending a gift, he also prepares himself for war. Let's think about this for a second. Should Yaakov feel inferior that he is somehow buttering up a murderous tyrant and he's trying to appease him with gifts? You know, in today's day and age, we all believe in communication. If you have a problem with me, say something to my face. And so, you know, if Yaakov went to see his therapist in November of 2021, one might make the argument that his therapist should say, you know, you, Yaakov, should pull Esau to the side of the road when you meet each other, away from the militias, and say, you know, Esau, it seems like you're bothered by the situation. Why don't we talk about it? Right? And bribe him with a petting zoo. Well, the commentators ask this question. The commentators make the point that Yaakov did not feel inferior in this moment because he realized that the sending of cattle was really only a way of creating space for God's protection. Yaakov did not feel like oxen and donkeys were the solution to his problem. God would provide him a solution to his problem. And he realized that sending animals was his way of making space for God's blessing to find space in this world. So Yaakov goes about this whole thing and he does not feel inferior. He feels like he's doing the right thing. Well, I got news for you. The petting zoo does not deter Esau's march. And he and his 400 bands of men continue marching towards Yaakov. And there's this penultimate moment where Yaakov and his family stand there, and Esau and his 400 bands of militia are coming towards him, and they face off face to face. Rick, read what happens, please, in text 3.
Esau ran toward Jacob and embraced him. He fell on Jacob's neck and kissed him, and they went.
And it was beautiful. And roll credits and the dramatic music plays, and everyone finishes their popcorn and stands up in the movie theater and brushes themselves off and goes home, and they all lived happily ever after. Well, says the Torah, not so fast. Not so fast. If you take a look inside the Torah, you will find something fascinating. In this week's Torah portion, the word in Hebrew which denotes that Esau kissed Yaakov in Hebrew is written Vayishakeu. Vav Yud Shun, Vav Yud Shin, Vav Yud Shin, Kuf Hey Vav. And in fact, in the Torah, the word Vayishakehu has dots over it. There is a dot on top of every single letter in the Torah scroll. When the Torah places, now bear in mind, the Torah scroll does not have any sort of punctuation or grammar or annotations. It's just the letters. There is literally a handful of words that have these dots on top of them. And the tradition is that when there is a word that has dots on top of it, the Torah is trying to send us a message. It's the Torah equivalent of putting an asterisk beside a word which requires just a little bit of context. Ask the commentators, what is the Torah trying to convey to us by putting dots on top of the words Vayishakehu? Jacob, read for us text 4 on page 120, please.
The Torah features dots for the words and kissed him. This is because Esau did not kiss Jacob wholeheartedly. Rabbi Shimon ben
Yochai
said it is established fact that Esau hates Jacob. Nevertheless, his compassion was moved at the time, and he kissed him wholeheartedly.
We have an argument. An argument, what is the Torah trying to convey? And there are two opinions, what the Torah is trying to convey. One opinion, that of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, I don't know why they put this, the second opinion first in the slide, is that it was, the first opinion is that it was temporary, genuine love. And the second opinion is it was fake. So one thing is for sure, when Esau comes up and he kisses Yaakov, they did not live happily ever after. This did not somehow turn over a new page in their relationship and everything was wonderful and they lived arm in harmony for the rest of their lives. In fact, after this episode, the Torah says that Esau says to Yaakov, hey bro, where are you going? We should travel together. To which Yaakov responds, no thanks. And he says, I've got small kids. I travel at a different pace than you. You go your way, I'll go my way. I'll catch up to you. But we're good. But the point that the Torah makes is, whether you want to say that the love in that moment was fake, or whether you want to say that it was real, but it was fleeting, one thing is for sure. As a result of this episode, Esau was not transformed. Either it was a fake kiss, or it was a real kiss that lasted all of a few minutes. Now, come along, the commentators, and make a point. If Esau was not transformed as a result of this encounter, if this little dramatization in the Torah did not change who Esau was as a human being, there must be a fundamental reason why this story is shared. If this moment would have been one which turned over a new leaf for Esau, I would understand why the story was told. Because from here we see the power of transformation, and Yaakov really touched something deep within his brother and made him a new man. But that's not what we're saying, according to all opinions. Esau was not transformed as a result of this encounter. So why does the Torah tell us a story? What lesson is there in the story for us to learn if Asa was not transformed as a result of this somehow half-hearted kiss? Explain the commentators, actually, the fact that Asa was not transformed by this kiss and absolutely maintained his persona, maintained the reality of being a bloodthirsty bandit, yet he kissed him in that moment. There's something very, very profound that we can learn from that story, which has been a guiding light for Jewish people for generations. We can and should wield influence over the Asavs of our generations. There will be forces out there that will seek to do us harm. There will be forces out there that will seek to hurt us. What is our goal for our interactions with these individuals, for our interactions with these Asavs of our generations? Our goal is not total transformation. Our goal is temporary relief. Our goal is get whatever we need out of that situation to guarantee our continuity moving forward and then leave it. Recently, I heard an interview. In this class, we've been quoting great philosophers, Jewish sages, wise men and women across the generations. I heard an interview that took place a couple nights ago with Quinn Snyder. Quinn Snyder is the head basketball coach of the Utah Jazz. The Jazz right now are not doing very well, for those of you that are concerned. They're mired in a slump. They're losing a whole bunch of games. They need to turn around the ship before Jewish Heritage Night. Things will be much better when we go see them on Hanukkah. But in the meantime, things are not wonderful. So Quinn Snyder was asked, how do you coach a team in the middle of a slump? And Quinn's attitude is, get to the next play. Quinn quoted, I have to admit, I never watched the show, but people speak of it very highly. Supposedly there's a very popular show now called Ted Lasso, and it's on Apple TV for those of you who have watched it, about an American who goes to coach in England or the other way around. And I believe the story is modeled after a true story, and the character who they're depicting in the story once said that a coach, a professional coach, needs to have the memory of a goldfish. You can't dwell on things in high pressure situations. You have to, something happens, you miss a play, other team scores, whatever happens, you forget about it and you move on. So Quinn says that his attitude in coaching is get to the next play. People think coaches are motivational speakers in their spare time. You know, the team is losing and you sit down and you pull up a chair and you look the men in the eyes and you say, men, we have come to fight. And Quinn's point is no, you're not going to change their lives in the middle of a huddle. You're going to get them to the next play and hopefully they score the next basket and they're going to stop on defense the next play and our team scores more points than their team. Get to the next play. Jacob was not trying to change Esau's life, and Esau would write a book about how Jacob changed his life and he became a man with a long white beard, who'd go to synagogue every Shabbat. No. Jacob had one attitude in his encounter with Esau. Make sure he doesn't kill me and my family. What happens beyond that? What happens afterwards? What happens with the rest of his life? I don't care. So long as he's not bothering me and my family. We can and should wield influence over the Asavs of our generations. Ilana, text 5, page 121.
The Midrash relates that when Rabbi Yanai would set out for a meeting with the Roman government, he would first read this passage in the Torah regarding Yaakov and Esau. The sages had a tradition that this passage would guide for our Eichah. Therefore, when Rabbi Yanai is the ruler of Rome for communal issues, he would consult this passage to follow the advice of the right judge. It is indeed appropriate for all generations to study his approach, adopt it.
Interesting. Rabbi Yanai, who was one of the sages, one of the leaders of the Jewish people during the Talmudic era, was dealing with issues that the government was putting in place, and he would have to go and speak to the very government that was putting in place the problems for his people. And every time he would go and lobby the government to either rescind their more problematic decrees or to put in place positive decrees, he would first study this passage to realize that when we, as the Jewish people, require situations where we need help from a situation that seems a little bit out of control, we copy Jacob's plan of action. We pray, and as we talked about in lesson 1, we don't suffice with just praying. Our prayer motivates us to put a plan in action. And so we prepare ourselves for worst case scenario, and we also try to appease those in power. You might recall, Jacob read for us earlier text 4, and there was a very powerful statement. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said it's an established fact that Esav hates Yaakov. Suppose for a moment you were to interview Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, and you were to ask him how would he handle a situation that requires a little bit of sensitive maneuvering. The Jewish people are in a situation where the government has put in place decrees and they're up against the creek. What would Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai say to you? After all, he's the one who says it's a well-known fact that Jews and non-Jews hate each other. What would Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai say? Well, beyond the fact that this is his opinion that's been documented, we know that in his personal practice, he actually treated the situation a little bit differently. Esther, read for us text 6.
The Roman government once issued a decree that Jews may not observe Shabbat, circumcision, and family purity. The Jews said to themselves, who should go to Rome to solicit annulment of the decree? Let Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai go, he has experienced miracles.
And in fact, he went. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who said it is an established fact that Esav hates Yaakov, which Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai is speaking about an episode that transpired millennia earlier. This is in biblical times. So when Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said it's an established fact that Esav hates Yaakov, in essence, what was he saying? It's an established fact that Rome hates Israel. The Esav of his generation hates the Yaakov of his generation. So I might think that in Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai's time, when his people are placed in a situation where the government is of opposition to his people, the people regarding whom it's known that it's an established fact that they hate his people, what would Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai do? Say, no, haters are going to hate. What am I going to do? They hate us. Notwithstanding the fact that he believed them to hate us, it was he who went to Rome and actually annulled the decree. Because Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai practiced the mentality that was embodied by Yaakov in this week's Torah portion. They hate us. There's not a lot we can do about that. In fact, one might make the argument there's nothing we can do about that. But here's what we can do. We can get to the next play. We can focus on annulling this specific decree and moving on. We are not here to reflect with them on the totality of their choices and the totality of their life experiences and why they are this way and how they are this way. Nothing good will come of that. We are here to get to the next play. We are here to change their choice in this particular situation. In fact, throughout our history, and actually, as we move into more contemporary times, this has become a very powerful theme across our history. The Jewish people, specifically in Europe, created a reality called shtadlanim. Shtadlanim comes from the Hebrew word hishtadlut, which means effort. The Jewish people created a reality called court Jews. And nowadays, it's sometimes a term which is not used in a very positive connotation, but for centuries it was. If you take a look in your books at page 123, figures 4.1, it goes through about 3 centuries, from the 16th century into the 19th century, various very, very, very powerful regimes that actually had Jewish men who were part of the court, whose job it was to lobby their own governments about various protocols and practices that were being put in place that may be harmful to the Jewish people. And so the very same dictators that were putting in place Lord knows what to harm the Jewish people also allowed in their court for there to be an advocate of the Jewish people whose job it was to have a position of power from the very government seeking to harm their people to intercede on their behalf. To really kind of understand the incredible dichotomy of the situation, we're going to focus on one of the 6 men featured here. In fact, the very first one, his name was Yosef of Rashaim. Yosef of Rashaim lives from 1480 to 1554 in Vienna, and he advocated on behalf of the German Jews in the courts of Maximilian I and later his grandson, Charles V. Does anybody know who Charles V's others, Bubby and Zaidi, was? Charles V, like many European rulers at that time, came from royal stock. He had royalty on both sides of the bloodline. So Charles V, who was the king of the German Empire at that time, does anybody know who his other Bubby and Zaidi was? King Ferdinand of Spain. Charles was the grandson of the king and queen who had created the Spanish Inquisition. And he now ruled over a different part of Europe. So one might well assume where Charles V's head was, what kind of human being he was, where his motivations lay. He was the king of what was then the German Empire. And yet, he had a Jew in his court who had a formal position whose job it was to lobby the government so as not to make decrees or policies that were harmful to the Jewish people. He was quite good at his job. And he often diaried or wrote reflections of his experiences. Esther, be up to you or Avila? I forgot. Did you read already? You did, Avila. Text 7, page 124.
In 1531, the announcers once again founded the Emperor Charles V while he was in Belgium and Poland. Lands inhabited by Jews, many who visited traveled to those lands to oppose the accuser. With the help of God, I was at the court of exalted Emperor before him, from the first of Adar until the first of Sivan, pursuing the interest of Jewish communities. Although
Rothroyds
attempted to swallow me alive and to bring about my demise, God in his great mercy sent his messengers and saved me from his hand and from all those who sought to harm me. Do I keep on?
Please.
At that time, I had an audience with the emperor in his private chamber. I spoke to him for as long as I needed, and he responded to my letter. During this period, when I had free time and was secluded in my room, I offered a book entitled The Sanctified.
I think it's important to point out. So Joseph of Russian talks about his experiences in 1531. So it's about 40 years after the Inquisition started. At that point, Spain was actually under the jurisdiction of Charles V, and post-Inquisition policies were still being carried out. So for context, Charles V is the man who's responsible for continuing to burn Jews at the stake. Now, Joseph of Russia did not come to his holy emperor, Charles V, and say, Your Majesty, I've been approached by the United Jewish Federation of the European countries to bestow upon you the title righteous Gentile amongst the nations. Now, he was quite clear where Charles V's allegiances lay and what he thought of the Jewish people. Yet, Joseph of Rusheim had a responsibility. He had a task at hand to change the decrees that affected a certain segment of that community. And here's the remarkable thing. He was successful. That was his entire job. There were powers that be in the royal setup that tried to thwart him, but he was successful because he focused on the mission at hand. Whatever he had to do, whatever he had to say to get this particular decree averted, he did. He did not transform Charles V into a profound lover of the Jewish people. That was not in the cards. That was not part of the job description. That was never the expectation. He got him to change his mind on a specific piece of, let's call it legislation, that had to be passed. Interestingly enough, an episode that really encapsulates the reality of shtadlanim, of these court advocates, is actually featured in a fascinating piece of art that is currently housed at the Prado Museum in Madrid. This picture is called The Expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, and it actually features a great Jewish sage by the name of Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, who actually wrote a commentary on the Chumash, many of you might be familiar with. He was a court Jew. He was someone who had a place in King Ferdinand's court. The very king who created the expulsion had a Jew in his court whose job it was to advocate for the Jewish people. And prior to the expulsion of the Jewish people, you can actually see this image much better in your books. And you can see it here up on the screen. He actually had 3 different audiences with King Ferdinand, in the middle of one of which he brought a tremendous sum of money to try and convince King Ferdinand to stop the Inquisition. It's told that the chief inquisitor at the time, Thomas de Torquemada, came in and famously said that Jonas sold him for 30 pieces of silver, and now you want to sell him again. When King Ferdinand heard that, he scrapped any progress that Don Isaac Abarbanel had made, and sure enough, the Inquisition happened. But the point is, interestingly enough, that before the Inquisition, there was actually an entreaty made on behalf of the Jewish people of Spain directly to the king to scrap this plan. Now, it's interesting to point something out. Who was Abarbanel's meeting with in this picture? It was not with the chief inquisitor. Even throughout our history, we have been mindful of the fact that there are those people whose minds are not changing. But we've spoken a lot about the story of Purim. In the story of Purim, we never find that Mordechai convinces Esther to go and speak to Haman. That never happens. You will always have your Hamans. You will always have your Hitlers. You will always have your Torquemada, the chief inquisitors. Those people's minds aren't going to be changed. We don't advocate with such, in fact, we don't talk with such people. We don't try to engage them because clearly the level of hate inside such figures has risen to levels that doesn't really comply with reason. But in Abarbanel's case, he went to the king. In Esther's case, she went to Achashverosh. In our previous fellow, I'm forgetting his name, in Yosef of Russia, he went to King Charles, and so on and so forth. When we find a power who we think might be sympathetic to reason or pleading or begging or bribery, that has always been part of the Jewish people. And in fact, as we think about it, again, we talked about Yaakov feeling inferior as he had to beg for the existence of his people. In the eyes of the Jewish people, this is not about feeling inferior. This is not about lowering ourselves to somebody else's standards. We believe that our salvation comes at the hands of God. In the text that spoke about Rabbi Shimon going to intercede from the Romans, the text says, let it be Rabbi Shimon, as he is the one through whom God performs miracles. We see quite extensively in the text of Yosef of Russia, how he talks about the fact that he was there to do God's work. He was there to do God's work in the royal court. He needed the king to assist in God's work, but in his mind, it was absolutely God's work. So this reality of having the three-pronged approach that was first demonstrated by Yaakov has been part of the Jewish history since time immemorial. We don't feel that pleading with an authority makes you feel inferior, because recognizing that you are in God's hands, you're not the one to feel inferior. Now, there's an issue with this potentially. Presumably, any ruling power, king, queen, prime minister, president, I don't care. Any human being that is in a position of power, that has put in place a rule, a law, a decree, whatever it is, to harm the Jewish people, clearly shows some measure of anti-Semitic bias. If we accept that to be true, what are we hoping to accomplish by doing it? Would it be fair to say, once an anti-Semite, always an anti-Semite? In July of 2006, July 28th of 2006 to be particular, there was a gentleman who was pulled over for speeding in Malibu, California. The officer who pulled him over, whose name was James Mee, M-E-E, noticed alcohol on his breath, and he offered a breathalyzer test to this individual whom he had pulled over for speeding. The person that was speeding, I looked at your notes, I saw you wrote him down, I started laughing. The person who was pulled over for speeding failed the breathalyzer test, and so the officer had no choice but to take him into police custody. Does anybody know who was speeding in Malibu, California on July 28th of 2006?
Mel Gibson.
Mel Gibson. When Mel Gibson was taken into police custody, he asked the arresting officer if he was a Jew, and Officer James Mee responded in the affirmative. He was indeed a Jew, and Mr. Gibson had several not nice things to say about Officer Mee and his people. Chief among them, Jews are responsible for all the wars in the world and a host of other not nice things. Well, media very quickly picked up the story. It happened in Malibu, news capital of the world, and everyone and their cousin has an opinion about Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson, a raging, flaming anti-Semite. Well, Gibson actually later on apologized for what he had said, and he asked the world to realize that he is not a bigot or an anti-Semite. And everyone and their cousin developed an opinion whether Mel Gibson is in fact a flaming anti-Semite. Interestingly enough, there was a gentleman by the name of Dean Devlin, part of the Hollywood scene, who's a colleague of Mr. Gibson's, who gave an interview on the record saying that he spends an immense amount of time with Mel Gibson, and he has never, Mr. Devlin is Jewish, he has never heard Mel Gibson make any sort of comment in any form or fashion to connote the fact that he is an anti-Semite, and Dean Devlin encourages the world not to view Mel Gibson as an anti-Semite. Instead, what he said is a result of alcohol. So interestingly enough, around that time, there was a paper that was put out which talks about this issue. Which I think, it's funny, this paper was put out in 2011. Gibson was pulled over in 2006. Nowadays, in all seriousness, nowadays we live in a world of cancel culture, right? Nowadays we live in a world where if somebody is running for office and we find something they tweeted 175 years ago, we ruin their entire lives and we determine that we figured out everything that has to do with their life based on a comment that they've made, whether before the influence of alcohol or after the influence of alcohol. Is there truth to that? Forget from a religious standpoint, forget from a Jewish standpoint, from a scientific standpoint. Mr. Snow, text 8A, page 128.
Cognitive diversity. Brains are like representative democracies. They are built of multiple overlapping experts who weigh in and compete over different choices. There's an ongoing conversation among the different factions in your brain, each competing to control the single output channel of your behavior. When the hostess at a party offers chocolate cake, you find yourself on the horns of a dilemma. Some parts of your brain have evolved to crave the rich energy source of sugar. Other parts care about the negative consequences, such as the health of your party. Part of you wants the cake, and part of you tries to muster the fortitude to forego it. The final vote of the parliament determines which party controls your action. That is, whether you put your hand up or not. As the French essayist,
Michel de Montaigne, yeah, just go with it. As he says, yes, that guy.
yeah, there is as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others.
It's interesting, I'm quite pleased I'm not teaching this class to the people that I usually hang out with, young professionals, people in their 20s and 30s, because people of my generation have a very square way of looking at this world at times. You know, recently there was a vote in Congress about funding the Iron Dome. I believe, and Laura, I'm sure we'll have the correct stats on this if I'm wrong, I believe it was 426 to 9. There were 426 votes in favor of funding the Iron Dome, and there are 9 votes against funding the Iron Dome. There's a number of ways to look at that statistic. One might say the entire United States Congress is anti-Semitic. Why? Well, there were 9 members of Congress that voted against the Iron Dome, and there were 426 that voted for it. So to say the entire House of Congress is anti-Semitic might be a little bit of a stretch. There are those who will say the whole Democratic Party is anti-Semitic. Why? Well, because there were Democrats who voted against it. Yes, there were more than 215 that voted for it. The point is to look at the world in boxes, to put people or things or items or viewpoints in boxes is not a healthy way to go. Now, certainly not when you're looking at a group of people, and as Dr. Eagleman makes the point, not even when you're looking at yourself. There is as much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others. So now, Stacy, let's take this to Mel Gibson. Continue.
Returning to Mel Gibson, he asked whether there is such a thing as true politics. We have seen that behavior is the outcome of the battle of internal systems. To be clear, I am not defending Gibson specifically, but I am saying that a team of rivals brings naturally particles racist and non-racist feelings. Alcohol is not a true serum. Instead, it tends to tip the battle towards the short-term, unreflective faction, which has no more or less claim than any other faction to the true one.
So, did Mel Gibson do something despicable? Yes. Does that make Mel Gibson an irredeemable anti-Semite? Maybe. Maybe not. Dr. Eagleman will have you believe that there are parts that live on inside Mel Gibson, actions that Mel Gibson might take that might put him in the non-anti-Semite category. And the point that Dr. Eagleman makes in his neurological research is to say that a person should be somehow labeled or put in a box based on an episode here or there is inaccurate. Does hate live on inside the heart of Mel Gibson? Does Mel Gibson somehow deep somewhere inside not like Jewish people? Yes. Does that make Mel Gibson an anti-Semite? I don't know. It's not necessarily omnipresent. So going back to the figures that we've talked about today, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is of record saying that it's an established fact that the Romans hate the Jews. And yet, when Rome passes a decree that is not beneficial for the Jews, who's the first person who's going to get on their horse and go to Rome? The very same Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Because there is hate that lives in the heart of the Roman emperors. There is also something other than hate that lives in the heart of the Roman emperors. And so Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's thought was, perhaps I can somehow find that point that lives on inside them and harp on that and work that and not allow them to speak only from their bias, to speak only from their hate. And I think the point of that Dr. Eagleman makes, which I think is so crucial to think about in this instance, is that yes, there are absolutely people who deserve the term anti-Semitic. There are absolutely people whose opinions and convictions and passions and thoughts and speech and actions on this topic are irredeemable. I would refer to those people as a slim minority of the world that we live in today. For most people, there is definitely some hate that lives on in their heart. I'll tell you what, I'll pose this all to you. Why don't you raise your hand if you tell me that you are a person who lives every second of every day without any hate in your heart? Let he or she who has no hate in their heart cast the first stone. We all have some unhealthy feelings that live on inside us towards a person or a group of people, and none of us would like to be judged based on that feeling. And this has been the attitude of advocates for the Jewish people throughout the ages, is that most people aren't that. And therefore, if there's some redeeming quality that we can find within them, that we can build on within them, it might be worth a shot. Now, we've gone through history. We've talked about Yosef of Russia, we've talked about Abarbanel, we've talked about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We've talked about situations where really mollification and gift giving was the only possible option. Yosef of Russia represents his people to a bloodthirsty murderer. What's he supposed to do in this private audience? Bang his fist on the table and say, "Your Majesty, I demand that you rescind your decree." Yeah? What are you going to do if I don't? Bang your fist again? Like what? Step this out for me. Every demand needs to be grounded in something. There's got to be carrot and stick. What's the stick if I don't behave? So we've been talking about a lot of people that have had really no other resort but carrot. Thankfully, we live in a world where we have sticks. Most Jews nowadays live in democracies where there's freedom of speech. If there's a politician that displays anti-Semitic bias, we have the opportunity to try and vote them out of office. We can boycott their appearances. We can protest. We can go on this great tool called social media and say things in a very loud voice, all in caps lock, and hope that somebody hears us and actually does something based on our rant. So putting Yosef of Roshheim aside for a second, and putting Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai aside for a second, in a situation where we have a choice to make between war, to use Yaakov's examples, and gifts, what does the Torah encourage for us? I tell the story, talking about Jews who live in democracies. I tell the story about a Jew who was living in Moscow who applied for an exit visa. He wanted to move to Israel. So one morning at 3 a.m. was a knock at his door. The KGB comes to his door and they say, "Jew, you applied for a visa to move to Israel?" He says, "Yes." And he says, "Here in Russia, you have food to eat?" He says, yeah, I can't complain. "And here in Russia, you have a place to live and a place to work?" He says, yeah, I can't complain. "So why do you want to move to Israel?" "Because there I can complain." So nowadays we live in environments where we can complain. So if we can complain, what should we do? Should we complain or should we try to figure something else out? So we started this whole segment talking about President Pompeo. Let's find out what actually happened to Pompeo. Mike, text 9. Back to the New York Times. Text 9, page 131. President Nixon.
An angry president?
Yes.
President Nixon made a hurried trip to New York yesterday to apologize to President Pompidou, who was angered by what he termed insults himself and his wife during pro-Israeli demonstrations touched off by his state visit to the United States. The French president had been angered by a jostling that members of his party received from demonstrators in Chicago, whose actions were marked by boos and angry cries, and by what he viewed as acceptance of such hostile acts by the Chicago police.
So turns out what Ilana had suggested was the course of action that was chosen by Chicago's Jews back in 1970. And when Pompidou showed up in Chicago, they were not very happy. They chose violence. They chose war.
No, they chose protest.
They chose protest. Right. When I say war, I mean the Torah's option. As opposed to gift giving, they chose opposition. Interestingly enough, the Rebbe actually spoke about their actions that Shabbat. Let's read together 10a on page 132. The public protests against the president of France angered French officials. This blocked any lobbying efforts that French Jews might have been able to make to prevent or at least reduce French assistance to Arab countries that are hostile to Israel. The stated reason for these protests was to demonstrate that America is a democratic country and that American Jews are not cowardly. This is a worthwhile objective when Jewish lives are not at risk. However, when Jews are threatened with the sale of many military jets to Libya, we have two options. We can organize public protests, or we can make every effort to either prevent or postpone the sale, reduce the number of jets sold, or at least prevail upon the French to send less effective planes. Such aims can only be achieved through quiet diplomacy. The proof is that agreements of this nature have been reached in the past. And they never went on to elaborate what he was referring to. When Mr. Pompidou visited the United States, there were mass protests against him intended to intimidate France. This effort backfired. It can now be said that despite the French embargo against selling arms to belligerents in the Middle East, the French president had allowed the sale of small arms and light weapons to Israel, items that can be sold without attracting publicity. However, as a result of the demonstrations, the approval for such sales was withdrawn. After some time, when he was no longer being disparaged, he resumed dealing with Jews behind closed doors and reinstituted the small arms sales. He also arranged for 300 Jews to be able to leave Egypt. All of this was accomplished without demonstrations and without publicity. The Jewish media was warned against disclosing any of this, and we only know of this from the non-Jewish press. The conclusion we must draw from this case is that we do not influence anti-Semites by constantly yelling at them, "You are an anti-Semite, you are a thief, you are a murderer." Rather, engage them in diplomatic conversation. Although such individuals are well aware of what we think about them, they are nevertheless human beings and they wish to behave like human beings. In 1972, forget Pompidou for a second. In 1972, there was a United States senator elected from the state of North Carolina. His name was Jesse Helms. Again, some of you live in an era where you are nodding your heads wisely. Pardon me, I only learned about Mr. Helms over this past week. Mr. Helms, for more than a decade, was not exactly a very profound supporter of the state of Israel. In fact, he repeatedly in the Senate voted against a number of measures that were there to support Israel. So much so that in 1982, after Israel invaded Lebanon, he actually suggested that the United States break off diplomatic relations with Israel. And of course, as is part of our history, a number of pro-Israel groups got together and tried to unseat Mr. Helms, Senator Helms. He was not extremely helpful to the Jewish people or the Jewish cause. In 1984, Chabad held an event in Washington, D.C. In 1982, the Rebbe had turned 80, and President Reagan had sent the Rebbe a scroll of honor, marking the Rebbe's 80th birthday, which was signed by President Reagan, the vice president, and both houses of Congress. Believe it or not, in 1984, there was actually one issue which you can get all 100 senators and 435 members of Congress to agree on. That was that they supported the Rebbe's initiatives to improve the ethical and moral foundations of education in American public schools. And so the Rebbe was sent a scroll of honor by President Reagan in both houses of Congress. And in 1984, Chabad made an event in DC to mark the Rebbe's receiving of this scroll of honor. One of the very high-profile attendees at this event was Senator Jesse Helms. As it happens, Senator Helms was a very passionate believer in raising the level of ethical and moral foundation in America's public schools, very much believed in a number of the rights that the Rebbe was championing, and so he came to the event, he spoke at the event. There was a Jew present at the event, many of you may have heard of. His name is Professor Alan Dershowitz. Professor Dershowitz, who was someone who had quite a bit of correspondence with the Rebbe, sent a scathing letter to Chabad World Headquarters protesting the fact that Senator Helms was given an opportunity to speak at this event put on by Chabad with Senator Helms's voting record on Israel widely known as a matter of record. And the Rebbe sent him back a letter, and the Rebbe actually included a very, very powerful postscript in the letter. Rick, text the letter, page 136.
I trust you will agree that in regard to persons of influence, whether in Washington or elsewhere, the first objective should be to persuade and encourage such a person to use his influence in a positive way on behalf of any and all good causes which are important to us. We should welcome every public appearance which lends public support to the cause, especially when there is a likelihood that it may be the forerunner of similar pronouncements in the future. My experience with such people, though I have never personally met the said person, has convinced me that politicians are generally motivated more by expediency than by conviction. I believe I was the first clue there. In other words, their public pronouncements on various issues do not stem from categorical principles or religious imperatives. Hence, most of them, if not all, are subject to changing their positions depending on time, place, and other factors. I believe, therefore, that the proper approach to such persons by Jewish leaders should not be rigid. As a rule, it does no good to engage in a cold war, which may often turn into a hot war, nor does it serve any useful purpose to brand one as an enemy or an anti-Semite. However tempting it is to do so, even if that person vehemently denies it can only be counterproductive. On the contrary, ways and means should be found to persuade such a person to take a favorable stance, at least publicly. We haven't too many friends, and attaching labels, etc., will not gain us any. Instances abound where the approach advocated above produced good results. There's surely no need to point out to you responsible Jewish leaders consistently cultivated good public relations, indeed even cordial relations, with President Carter and his predecessors going back to Roosevelt, regardless of their sometimes openly negative feelings toward Jews and Jewish causes.
This was the Rebbe's response to Professor Dershowitz. In 1986, Senator Helms assumed a very influential role on the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You know what happened after 86? Senator Helms, good state of North Carolina, became one of the most hardline pro-Israel members of the United States Senate. Now, to be fair, I am not saying that when Senator Helms was at a pro-Chabad event in 1984, someone slipped him a Chabad cocktail that had been made at 770, and he drank the Kool-Aid, and that's why he became flamingly pro-Israel. I don't know why Senator Helms became pro-Israel. I don't think the Rebbe is professing to know why Senator Helms became pro-Israel. But you know what? He did. In fact, Professor Dershowitz actually wrote about this. Professor Dershowitz wrote about his correspondence with the Rebbe, and Professor Dershowitz himself makes reference to the fact that after 1984, Helms became very, very pro-Israel. And he writes about how his perspective was changed as a result of this little Helms experience, the Helms experiment, as it were. The Rebbe's mentality, what the Rebbe believes to be Torah's mentality about these sorts of situations, was always quite clear. There's not a lot to gain by putting people in boxes. There's not a lot to gain by branding people with labels and assuming that we take a certain stance against them because their positions are irredeemably evil. Granted, there's definitely a few people in every generation who are worthy of that type. But by and large, there is always some measure of good that can be found by focusing on some measure of reason or rationale or common ground that exists within the people who disagree with us, that exists within the people who are currently taking steps and taking actions that run directly counter to our interests. What I didn't tell you when we started speaking about President Pompidou earlier is that whilst he did uphold an embargo against heavy arms to Israel, and while he did send 50 Mirage jets to Libya, he was open to backroom dealings to benefit Israel in other ways. Backroom dealings which he stopped after he and his wife and their staff were accosted in Chicago. And it's interesting that in the discussion against Pompidou, there's specific mention made to the fact that he was open to certain realities which were not garnering attention. I think we all have lived long enough in this world to know that politicians will take very loud public stances, and what they actually choose to do on the ground might sometimes differ from that quite profound. And it's those areas of difference, those areas of compromise that we can take advantage of, that we stand to jeopardize by calling them all anti-Semites and evil and sending them to their corner. Now, Ilana is going to disagree with me very profoundly, so let's go. Yes, Ilana.
No, I'm not disagreeing profoundly. I mean, I understand the concept, but I think caveat, of course, is like he is a politician and he says, the rabbi says, they just don't have any strong feeling. They just go.
They're guided by expediency more than conviction. Yes.
You can understand. But the point I wanted to make is that there is a cut from anything that we have done, from even Esav and Yaakov and the court and everything, because in 1948, now we have Israel, and so we don't need the court, the Jewish courts, the court of Jews and all, because it's a completely different equation. And Yaakov, you said, he prays and he does the things, but he prepares for war.
Sure.
And that is the third issue that we haven't talked about, which is then you prepare for war.
Sure.
And you mentioned only the carrots, and we don't have the stick, but we do have the stick.
Sure.
In the example of the Golan is embargo with the boats that he basically, those were the one that Israel had paid for. Israel just put a commando and they went in Shabu and they brought the boats that they had paid and they put them out and they sailed them all the way in the Mediterranean. And when they arrived in Israel, they said to the French, basically, F you, because we paid for it and now we got them. And that was the stick.
So I'm going to disagree with you on a few points. Number one, I'm going to disagree with you that after 1948, the situation that just because there's a Jewish state, that somehow changes. I think the reality is that we live in a free country and the strongest democracy in the world. And I think that regularly we have the opportunity to confront people who have opinions that are very dangerous towards Jews and the Jewish land and the Jewish people. And I think we have to maintain the exact same realities towards them as we would have whether Israel existed or not. I think specifically when dealing with American politicians, I think that this notion of prayer, gift, and war should always be our guiding philosophy, whether we have a Jewish state or not. And for me, the fact that we have a Jewish state and whatever that means, I don't know how that necessarily has bearing on how we would handle local people who seem to be taking certain positions that might seem dangerous to our people. Number one. Number two, as it pertains to the idea of more having some stick and less carrot, sure. Someone let's take Senator Helms, for example. So what are you going to accomplish with a stick? You're not going to invite him to the event? You're going to show him that what? That his positions are intolerable? That's not war, that's childish.
Yeah, no, I don't.
So, you want to talk about if Israel has their Mirage jets that they paid Libya for that they're not getting, they have to make a military decision. But seeing as for people like us, by and large, the situations that we find ourselves in are usually diplomatic, the realities of our situation is we're going to usually have far more carrot than stick because we don't really have a war option.
But would you would you invite Ilan Omar or AOC at a function? I mean, they are bluntly.
Okay.
anti-Semitic.
Would I, so
It's like,
I'll give you,
why don't
you know what, Ilana? I'll give you an
it.
example. I will give you an example. Give you a very, because I had this conversation with somebody earlier this year. Thanks, I have to make sure you finish the class. Okay, I'll give you an example. In May, we had the episode with the swastika. Okay, various politicians chimed in publicly with their, deep thoughts and prayers and feelings and empathy and all the nice things people put on Twitter. I made a decision. Every single politician that was going to say something nice about the fact that there was, their support, not to say something nice about the swastika, say something nice in light of the swastika, I was going to respond on social media with nothing but thanks and appreciation. So there's a person here in town that got very, 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 very upset. Because in their mind, in their perspective, there's a member of Congress from this great state that in their minds is the equivalent of their AOC or their Ilhan Omar. And how dare a Jew, how dare a rabbi treat this politician on social media with any sort of grace or empathy or love or respect or anything polite. You should have blocked his tweet. So I said to him, with all due respect, if I was living in the state of New York, if I was living in New York's 14th congressional district and someone put a swastika on my synagogue and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted in support of my community, I would treat that tweet the exact same way. I would treat AOC's tweet the same way I treated Mike Lee's tweet. Now, would I invite AOC to come and give the drasha here on Shabbos or come speak at the Kiddush? I would, only because she probably won't come. But if I was inviting every member of Congress, Republican and Democrat alike, to a function to come and show their support for the Jewish people, show their support for Israel, I would invite her. I would absolutely invite her. Is she going to come? Probably not. But absolutely. And if she doesn't want to come, that's her prerogative. And if she doesn't want to come, great. Let her explain that to her base. But the notion that some people, if they want to show their support for the Jewish people or to treat them with the dignity that we give them that opportunity, we categorically move away from that, I don't believe that to be the Jewish path in this sort of situation. There are members of the local legislature. We invite every member of the local legislature, House and Senate, to the menorah lighting at the Capitol next Sunday. Many of them come. Many of them don't come one year or another, family, prior commitments, blah, blah, blah. There are a few we know who will never set foot. You know what we do? We invite them anyway. Some years they fumble and bumble to come up with an excuse why they can't come. Some years they ignore the invitation. And that's their prerogative. One year, one of them got dragged. One year they had a friend, a relative, a donor, someone dragged them to the menorah. And you know what? They told that person afterwards they profoundly enjoyed it. They never came back again, but they enjoyed it. For what it's worth. Maybe it changed their perspective on life. Maybe it didn't. But that's something which will never truly be. Let's see this idea expressed in tonight's lesson.
Negative thoughts, actions, and speech create negative energy. Conversely, positive thoughts, actions, and speech create positive energy. And that's what led to an idea that has its genesis in South Africa, to the idea of art, acts of random kindness. You see, this is kind of shaped a little bit, more or less, if you use your imagination, like Noah's Ark. And the idea is you take some change, place it in here, and when it's filled up, you pass it along to someone who's less fortunate. It isn't just the money collected, it's the thought and the feeling that it represents.
I went to a public school. I studied math and physics, and we studied how to solve math problems. I didn't know how to solve math problems.
Rabbi David Aaron, a Jerusalem-based educator, reflects on his personal experience.
The real problems of life is what education should be focusing on. It's essentially about building people, and only great people will do great things.
It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Mr. President.
On March 3, 1981, then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, delivered a luncheon address of the Washington Hilton. Hotel was 2017, but as he headed to his limousine, a would-be assassin opened fire. Reagan was critically wounded, and the nation collectively gasped in horror. The president survived, and at a public gathering 2 weeks later, the Lubavitcher Rebbe insisted that the instructive lesson of the assassination attempt must similarly survive. The Rebbe saw the event as a wake-up call for the nation to upgrade its approach to education.
Told the fuck out of Medina without getting a big statement. The big statement we use for futurity. I was not getting a big statement, not getting indeed. These are not exporting. Ufto, Ufma, and the gates of labor order, as for time with each state. Also, this not every stock, as every gate to learn to the business. But the region learners are the as it's taking our rooms, entonces the taking our meeting at sea, entonces the ganzen nicht arrive in the dormitories or in the ground.
As much as we want to graduate mathematicians and scientists, we also want to graduate decent human beings.
Dr. Rona Novi, Dean of the Israeli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration, has given ample thought to this problem.
Very few educators would invite a charismatic speaker or have a big assembly program to create readers. They would understand that the way that we build reading skills is piece by piece and building block by building block. We start in kindergarten, first grade, and we keep building on it. Well, we need to look at character education and social emotional learning in exactly the same way.
Judaism teaches us that it's important to give charity every day. And the more you give charity, that muscle of kindness within you gets stronger and stronger.
Rabbi Levi Greenberg and his wife Shane are emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in El Paso, Texas.
We embarked on a campaign to bring this message of daily giving to every single child in El Paso. And so we brought to El Paso the ARC campaign. All the children in the school received one of these boxes, and they were told that the purpose of this box is to be taken home and filled every day. If they have extra coins, they should ask their parents for some money. After a month of collecting money, their class would nominate charities that should receive their combined money. And the winning charity would receive the combined monies that they have collected throughout that month. The ART project, giving money every day, takes acts of random kindness and turns them into acts of routine kindness.
Raising a generation of individuals empowered with a sense of purpose and trained to pursue acts of kindness is an important factor in curing and preventing new social ills, including reduction of hate and bigotry, along with anti-Semitism.
The more we give, the more we respect. Respect human life, respect property, the more dignity we have for ourselves and for society. We want to stop anti-Semitism. We have to stop hatred. And we have the opportunity to end hatred in the bud by increasing in acts of goodness and kindness and inspiring and encouraging all of humanity to do so. Every single person should give charity every day. And hatred is a thing of the past.
The call of the hour, more necessary than ever, is for each of us to adopt a charity box for regular daily contributions and to encourage all around us, family and friend, Jew and non-Jew, to act similarly. Actively demonstrate, encourage, and promote kindness, sympathy, and altruistic care. If a little illumination eliminates a lot of darkness, think of what a rapidly swelling force of systematic goodness can achieve for our communities, and ultimately for humanity. It's time to turn up the light.
Alrighty, we sadly, my friends, after 4 weeks, are at the phase where we are wrapping up the course takeaways. Let's take a look at figure 4.3 on page 130. Let's talk about some tips that we learned throughout this course when faced with negativity and hatred around us. We will remain calm. We will trust in God and upgrade our connection with Him. We will create natural means through which God can provide our security. We will not internalize anti-Semitism by altering our Jewish heritage. We will be open about our Jewish identity, benefiting Jews and fostering diversity. We will share awareness of God's mission for all humanity and thereby help individuals avoid experiencing an inner void. We'll thank God for the divine gift of the Holy Land and seek to strengthen its security and prosperity. And we will avoid labels and public shaming. Instead, we will work with whomever we can to ensure beneficial results for the Jewish people. This sums up everything we've talked about until now. And now I want to conclude with one last thing. And that is one of the best ways to fight against, to outsmart anti-Semitism, is to add Jewish unity. Unity. Why is that? Well, let's draw inspiration one last time from the story of Purim, and let's look at a perplexing way, at the most perplexing fashion, how Haman introduces the Jewish people to Achashverosh. Text 12a, taken from the book of Esther, chapter 3, verse 8. Vayomer Haman lamelech Achashverosh, Haman tells Achashverosh, Yeshnoi am echad nefuzar u'mefeired ben ha'amim b'chol medinos malchusecha. There is one nation that is scattered and dispersed among the nations throughout all the countries of your empire. Is that a problem? I should go to President Biden and say, President Biden, hear me out. The Catholic people across this nation, they're spread and scattered amongst your empire. Some of them live in the deep south, others live in the northeast, some of them live on the west coast. Who cares? Who cares where they live? Why is that a problem? This is your preamble to why the Jewish people are a cancer in our society, because they're spread out? Let's read text 12b. Haman claimed there is one nation that is scattered and dispersed. He was referring to the fact that the Jews were internally divided. He argued that they would be unable to defend themselves because a discordant people cannot develop a cohesive strategy, nor would they pay heed to their leaders. Subsequently, when the Jews repented, there was unity among them and they gathered in their cities with mutual love. We therefore send packages of food to one another on Purim to demonstrate this mutual love is cause of our deliverance. So on a basic level, Haman comes to Achashverosh and says, look, this is a risky plan. If you try to kill the Jewish people and they rise up against you, it may not end so well. So good news, they're not going to rise up against you because they're in disarray. They're a mess. They don't get along with each other internally. They don't listen to their leaders. So there's no chance of some sort of revolt being staged. In fact, what's the first thing that Esther tells Mordechai when the Jews began to hatch their comeback plan? Leich kenais says, Kol haYehudim, go gather all the Jews. Don't each of us repent and mourn and fast, this one in his synagogue and that one in their synagogue and that one in their synagogue. No, let's all get together. Because on a basic level, if they are cohesive, if they've gathered together as one, that is what warrants deliverance. And that's what the commentators say. That is why we share gifts of food with each other on Purim, to remember the fact that our togetherness is what brought about deliverance. Explain Jewish mysticism that it actually goes a step deeper than that as well. 3 times a day in our prayers in the Amidah, we ask God for his blessing and we say, Barchenu Avinu Kulanu Ka'achad, bless us, our Father, as we are together as one. And in fact, the commentators say that the more we are together as one, the more we are worthy of divine protection. Togetherness is crucial for our protection. Practically, we will be able to collaborate across the entire Jewish spectrum, and mystically, God will shower us with blessing and protection when we stand together with one united people. And so if there are 2 messages, which I might hope to leave you with from tonight, the first message be this: let us not name and shame, let us not banish people to the corners of society and say we want nothing to do with them, there's nothing to be gained by associating with them, and they are just damned in a certain sense. Let's try to find common ground with anybody and everybody and further our aims by finding something that we can work on with the people with whom we disagree. That is with the world at large, and specifically amongst our very own people, amongst the Jewish people themselves. Let us remember that in fact it is Jewish unity which is the single greatest cause for God to shower us with his blessing and his protection. It is the ability that we have to stand together as one, which brings us the blessings that we so need in our life for God to keep us safe. Any questions? Friends on Zoom, oh my goodness, I see we have three chats here. Good, all right.
Lesson 4, change of heart. Why? The Torah's narrative of Jacob and his son suggests that by employing the right words and deeds, we can influence those who deem to be against us. Accordingly, the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai traveled to Rome to make concessions for the benefit of the Jewish community, establishing a model founded by countless others, famously European court Jews of the Roman Empire. 2. Jews did not feel inferior while conducting diplomatic missions. They knew that the Jewish future depended on God, and that their job was to generate a garment behind which God could conceal his blessing. Firm belief that they were in God's hands inspired in them a sense. According to modern neuroscience, brains are built of multiple parts that weigh in concerning different choices, each part competing to control the single upward channel. This explains why an individual with Jewish friends can nevertheless carry out a drunken tirade against you. Conversely, it explains why Jews can gain assistance from other sources. 4. Today, finally able to campaign publicly against those who oppose us. However, it is often counterproductive to publicly brand individuals as enemies or anti-Semites. Slow to shame, quick to engage is still ineffective. 5. We must do everything possible to condition society to bring out the best in you rather than their more sinister ways. In the sphere of education, this means promoting an approach that is not restricted to acquiring information, but rather includes proper character traits, self-discipline, and the awareness that all humans are created to actively generate goodness in their environments. 6. Living in harmony with our fellow Jews enables us to better collaborate to ward off threats and promote our interests. Jewish mysticism teaches that God responds positively to Jewish, providing overt blessings of protection and goodness.
Ladies and gentlemen, it has been my profound pleasure joining with you for the past 4 evenings. You can continue this journey online at myjli.com/antisemitism. You should be receiving a survey in the next few days from the Jewish Learning Institute. We will be continuing our adult education offerings at the end of the month of January with meditation from Sinai. There are bookmarks on the table over there beside the apple tarts, which I highly recommend, with a brief overview of what that course will be offering. And I very much hope that we'll be able to see you all again sometime soon. It's been an absolute pleasure. An email will go out tomorrow morning with a class recap and a video recording. And I look forward to seeing you all hopefully sooner rather than later. Have a delightful evening, a very happy Hanukkah in the coming weeks, and I look forward to being in touch. Thank you, Susan.